All right, so we're diving into the OECD this time around.
The OECD.
Yeah,
That's
not exactly a household name, right?
No, not exactly a catchy acronym for like a must-listen podcast or anything.
Definitely not the most thrilling combination of letters.
Right.
But from what I've seen, it's actually way more interesting than it sounds.
Yeah.
So, what can you tell us about it? Like, for someone who's hearing OECD for the first time, what's the elevator pitch?
Well, you can think of it kind of like a global club
Okay.
with a pretty exclusive guest list.
Exclusive, huh? Like, who gets to be in this club?
So it's mostly countries that are considered, developed economies.
Right, right.
But it's not just about being wealthy. They also have to be committed to democratic values and a market economy, things like that.
So it's not just an economic club.
Exactly. It's more about working together to address global challenges
I see.
that affect everyone.
Okay, so what kind of challenges are we talking about here? Give me some examples.
Oh, just about everything you can think of. Education, healthcare, climate change, international trade, even things like digitalization and artificial intelligence.
Wow, that's a pretty wide range, isn't it?
It really is.
You'd think with so many countries involved, it'd be tough to get everyone on the same page.
It definitely has its challenges, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? To find common ground and come up with solutions that work for everyone.
I guess so, but do they actually make a difference? Like, does all this research and collaboration actually lead to real-world change?
Actually, yeah, they do. The OECD provides a lot of valuable data and analysis that governments and organizations use to inform their decisions.
Like what? Give me an example.
For instance, they played a key role in developing the concept of purchasing power parities, or PPPs, which helps us compare economic data across different countries more accurately.
PPPs, huh? That sounds familiar, but I'll admit I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a brain twister, but we'll definitely unpack that more later on.
Okay, good, because that's one I definitely need a refresher on.
For sure. But for now, let's stick with the OECD itself for a bit, if that's all right.
Oh, yeah. No, that's great. Let's do that. So we've got this club of countries. They're tackling these big issues. They're doing research, influencing policy. What else? What's something surprising about the OECD that most people probably don't know?
Well, one thing that might surprise people is that they're really focused on well-being, not just economic growth.
Well-being. That's interesting. So they're not just about, like, GDP and all that.
Right. They actually do a lot of work on measuring things like happiness, life satisfaction,
Yeah.
and social progress.
Huh. That's pretty cool. I mean, it makes sense, right? Money isn't everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They even have this initiative called Beyond GDP, where they look at alternative ways to measure progress.
Beyond GDP, I like the sound of that.
Right. So they're really trying to broaden the conversation about what matters most.
Okay, I'm starting to see why you find this organization so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just some stuffy old think tank. They're actually dealing with real-world issues that affect all of us.
Exactly.
And they're looking at the bigger picture, not just the bottom line.
I couldn't have said it better myself. They're all about finding solutions that create a better future for everyone.
Okay, so let's get back to those PPPs, purchasing power parities.
Right.
You teased that a little bit earlier, and now I'm really curious. What's the deal with these PPPs?
Okay, so have you ever traveled to, say, like Europe or Asia
Yeah, definitely.
and noticed how prices for like basic things can be wildly different?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I remember this one time I was in, I think it was Vietnam,
Okay.
and I got this amazing meal, like street food. Amazing. And it only costs like $1.
Right. You get that.
Just crazy.
You can't even get a coffee for that here.
No way.
Yeah.
So is that what PPPs are all about? Like figuring out how far your money actually goes in different places?
Exactly. It's basically a way to compare how much you can buy with the same amount of money in different countries.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do they actually calculate that?
Well, they use this thing called a basket of goods.
A basket. What's in this basket? Groceries.
Kind of, yeah. It's
Yeah.
basically a collection of everyday goods and services, like food and drinks, clothing, transportation, housing.
Okay, so like all the essential stuff.
Yeah. And they track the prices of all these things in different countries.
And then compare them.
Exactly. So let's say a basket of goods costs $100 in the U.S.,
Okay.
but that same basket costs only $50 in, say, India.
Okay, so that means, what, my money goes twice as far in India?
Exactly. You got it.
Wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about it like that before.
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at things than just using exchange rates.
So where does the OECD come into all of this?
Well, the OECD is one of the main organizations that actually calculates and publishes PPP data.
Oh, I see. So they're like the keepers of the basket.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And they use that data for all sorts of things, like comparing living standards across countries,
Hmm.
analyzing economic growth.
I bet that comes in handy.
It does.
So if we're looking at the world through these PPPs, what are some things that might surprise people? Like, are there any countries that seem a lot richer or poorer than we might think?
That's a great question. One thing that often surprises people is that when you factor in PIS-IPs, some countries that may not have the highest GDPs actually have really high standards of living.
Oh, really? Like who?
Well, a lot of European countries, for example, score very high on things like quality of life and social well-being, even if their economies aren't as large as, say, the US or China.
Interesting. So it's not all about just how much money a country has. It's about how far that money goes for the people who live there.
Exactly. It's about the actual purchasing power and what people can actually afford to buy with their income.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about what PPPs are and how they're calculated, but I'm still a little fuzzy on why this is also important.
Sure.
Like, why should we care about this? How does it affect us in the real world? So, like, how does knowing about PPPs actually change anything?
Well, for one thing, it can really change how we view global inequality.
Oh, okay, how so?
We often hear about the huge gap between rich and poor countries, right?
Right.
But when you factor in PPPs, that gap often narrows significantly.
Really? So, like, a country that looks really poor based on just their GDP might actually be doing a lot better in terms of their citizens' actual living standards.
Exactly. Because their money goes further.
Huh. That's fascinating.
It can also make a big difference for things like international aid and investment.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
Because if you're deciding where to allocate resources, you want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples, right?
Definitely.
Not just looking at raw numbers.
So PPTs give a more accurate picture of where the needs are?
Exactly.
This has really got me thinking. It's
Yeah.
like we often make assumptions about the world based on these simplified statistics,
Hmm.
but PPPs show us that there is often a lot more to the story than meets the eye.
I think that's a great takeaway from all of this.
So, to wrap things up, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to remember about the OECD and these PPPs?
I think the key takeaway is that the world is a complex place,
Ain't that the truth?
and understanding it requires looking beyond the surface.
Don't judge a country by its GDP.
Exactly. Dig a little deeper, look at the data, and you might be surprised by what you find. And hey, the OECD is a great resource for that kind of exploration.
It is, yeah. They've got a lot of really interesting stuff on their website.
They do.
So if any of this piques your interest, dear listener, go check it out.
Yeah, dive in.
You might just discover a whole new way of looking at the world,
Absolutely.
and maybe even some travel inspiration along the
I
way.
know, that's right.
All right, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to talk about the OECD.